Sarah Usherwood is here. We've got a lot of stories to talk about, but we are, of course, obviously very much concentrating this morning on the incredibly sad story of young Sarah Sharif, whose father and stepmother were yesterday found guilty of murder. Her mother, of course, who is estranged from him, Olga Domin, spoke out and said that basically the monsters who murdered my daughter should die in jail. A lot of you have got a lot to say about this morning. We're going to take a voice note now from Andrew.
Good morning, Mike. Andy in Portsmouth. Just to comment on the death of that poor young girl. I mean, I've got kids myself. They're grown up now, but I've also got grandkids, and I just can't comprehend anyone doing such barbaric, heinous acts to a child. An eye for an eye is what I say. He deserves to be locked up and be dealt with properly in prison. But I'd go as far as to say the death penalty for people like this too.
I think a lot of people would say the same, Andrew. Theo was talking about this earlier, and I mean, it's a very visceral feeling, especially as a parent or a grandparent, and you know exactly how you would feel if this was happening to somebody that you knew. I mean, it's just horrendous.
Yeah, it's horrendous, and I say the same as a parent as well. And you know, to Andy's, Andy's voice, very powerful voice note. You know, I'm somebody who's always opposed to the death penalty, but I can't argue against that.
Yeah.
What am I going to say? I can't argue. I can't, as a parent, argue.
It's very
against
difficult.
That. When you go through the litany of abuse this poor child has said, suffered. I'm stunned.
And when you talk about, one of the reasons perhaps being that we are supposedly a civilised country, well, why have we got so many uncivilised people living in it? That's what I would say. Gary says this, Mike, the only reason that all these ghastly things that are happening in this ruined country are our politicians have got no backbone, no guts, no nothing. I despair. And I think there's some truth to that. There is this culture in this country where nobody seems to take responsibility for anything. We talk about it in politics, don't we, where people don't resign anymore when things go wrong in the same way that they used to. People in public sector jobs continue to cling on to those jobs until the very last moment. It's just ridiculous, isn't it?
It was always what frustrated me. And I just sort of, I'd been a journalist for 20 years, and I would be sent to these cases. I worked for a news agency, and I'd be sent to these cases, and these were one of them was on a same level as this, and I'd sit in the courtroom, or you'd go to what they call a serious case review, and you'd sit around the table, and you'd have the chance to ask questions. And maybe I was a bit green, but I was like, so who's going to lose their job then? Yeah. Who's going to carry the can?
Who's going to carry the can?
Then is the council leader going to resign? Are they going to give up? Are they going to say this is too bad that actually they need to resign? No, we're learning lessons. Yeah, we're learning lessons. We've got it all covered. We're learning lessons, and then the same thing happens again. And I always came away from those. They were always the hardest stories to cover because you then get into the details. And actually, I really feel for the reporters. The coverage, the coverage right across the papers has been superb on this. But when you're actually covering it and you're hearing everything, and some of these things, and you cannot even write about because they are. I've covered cases where there's just no way of sort of writing about stuff as it's actually said in court or said at the serious case review because it's so horrific. Yeah. And there's this sort of what I really remember just making me really angry covering those cases was just the sort of glibness, the sort of triteness. Well, actually,
and they'll turn around and say, "Well, it's a very difficult job. it's not easy. And then sometimes they get sort of a bit kind of resentful of you even asking the questions. Well, why don't you try doing the job?
Nobody could doubt that it's a very difficult job to do, but it has to be done. Yeah, and we have to be able to, as to your point, we have to be able to say, what is going on. It doesn't matter who you are, your race, colour, creed, religion. We are going to go into the home and we are going to find out exactly what is going on.
And it has to be done by people who are good at it. Yeah. And not people who are willing. Remember with Baby P, they used to go into the house and the child would be smeared in chocolate, and the chocolate was there to cover the bruises and the marks on the body. And they didn't see that, they didn't know that, and they couldn't recognise that the house was filthy, that the house was full of, clues as to how this child was being treated, and they didn't see it.
And I think there's also, when you read this case, there's a sort of a slight acceptance that there is maybe abuse going on. And I remember covering a case where social services allowed a child to be, this was up in Mansfield, and I remember it quite vividly, social services allowed the child to be locked in their room at night. because the parents couldn't cope with the child between 7 and 7. Actually, the child ended up being locked in a room a lot longer, and they ended up hanging themselves on a curtain cord, and then there was a serious case review and lessons will be learned. But really what needs to happen is that if there is abuse, then that needs to be taken, there is abuse, and that needs to be taken seriously. And just finally, I think if some of your listeners are wondering, well, what if there's something that they could do, I think there's also a shortage of really good foster carers. And I imagine some of your listeners, Mike, are perhaps of a certain age, and they might be thinking, well, I'd like to do something to stop these cases happening. And I know there's a shortage of foster carers, and there'd be grandparents who'd be brilliant with children, absolutely superb. And actually, you know, there is...
But, you know, no doubt there will be councils that won't let you foster children. Because you might vote for reform.
You know, no, absolutely.
I mean, it's not a joke. I mean, the people will be told, no, you can't foster a child because of your political views. It's the kind of thing that goes on. It's mad, isn't it?
It's crazy, but that's... The whole system's broken. The whole child protection system's broken. And there just needs to be this government, and they need to find a way of making the changes, because it's like we're talking about the BBC and abuse in the BBC. It's just, I'd really love to be able to one day come into a studio like this and we talk about an absolutely horrific case and feel that somebody somewhere might actually do something to stop it happening. You know, that actually there won't be another Greg Wallace, there won't be another case like this, that actually people really want to get in and prevent these cases, whatever happens, and that there are real changes. And they're just, the system doesn't seem to be, you know, right across the board, never seems to be able to adapt to actually stop really, you know, so we can live in a better world.
Yeah, because nobody wants to take responsibility. That is the problem. We'll come back to this, and we'll be playing a variety of clips for you throughout the course of the morning, including a 999 call that was made about Sarah. But let's move on for the moment, because there's other stories that we need to do as well this morning, and we keep sending your voice notes in. By all means, keep calling us as well, 0344 499 1000, because we will be revisiting this story, obviously, throughout the course of the morning. Yesterday, we had the return of Prime Minister's questions. Keir Starmer back from his jollies in the Middle East, having been to Saudi Arabia, the place where now they're about to have a World Cup in 2030, I think it is. I was saying, Theo, earlier, imagine now if you're Keir Starmer and somebody says to you, do you think it's right that Saudi Arabia, a country with some very dubious human rights records, is having a world football tournament? He can't say anything because he's just been there with his begging bowl out, asking them to give us some money for some investment in the UK, please. I think
you put it best this week, just before we came on air, Mike. I think you should have been writing the questions for Kemi Badenoch yesterday. She went in on immigration and got absolutely hammered, and you know, Nigel Farage comes out of without having said a word at PMQs, he comes up 6-0 up. I mean, you know, because you know that was the perfect question, wasn't it, for for Keir Starmer at PMQs? Because what's he going to say? He wants to be Mr. You know, he wants to be Mr. Right On, but he's gone to Saudi Arabia and said, oh, please, can you invest in the UK? And now he's come, and now they've got a football tournament, despite an appalling human rights record and record.
Well, they're worse than Qatar, aren't they? I mean, at the end of the day.
You know, anyway, they behead people.
I'm sure Gary Lineker will enjoy going out and covering it. He's probably already got his visa sorted out. Here's Kemi Badenoch attacking Keir Starmer, as you say, over foreign criminals.
4 years ago, the Prime Minister signed a letter demanding that foreign criminals be allowed to stay in Britain. Dozens of Labour and Liberal Democrat MPs repeatedly signed these letters insisting that rapists and murderers be allowed to stay here. One of those criminals, Ernesto Elliott, had 17 convictions, including for knife crime. After his deportation was blocked, Elliott went on to murder someone. He was able to stay here and murder because people like this man campaigned against deporting criminals. Will he apologize for signing these letters?
Mr. Speaker, I'd firstly remind her that when we're in the number now, under their watch, of migrants coming to this country, nearly 1 million, is over 4 times the number when we're in the EU. They lost control of the borders. And the particular example she puts to me is an example of failure under her government to take the necessary measures to keep our country safe.
So, there was quite a lot of toing and froing over that. Here's another attack that Kemi Badenoch tried to make on immigration.
The Prime Minister has consistently backed criminals over law-abiding British people. He defends defended terrorists like Hizb ut-Tahrir in the European Court. He argued all immigration law had a racist undercurrent. He voted against life sentences for people smugglers. He voted against more than 100 measures to control migration. He even said it was wrong. He even said, Mr. Speaker, that it was wrong when the Conservatives took away Shamima Begum's citizenship. Now he has appointed her defense lawyer as his Attorney General. Mr. Speaker, events in Syria mean we may see more small boat arrivals. For once, will he take the side of the British people and strip citizenship from jihadi terrorists and supporters of Assad who want to come back and destroy this country?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I was Director of Public Prosecution for 5 years. Unlike anyone on their benches, I was prosecuting for 5 years hundreds of thousands of criminals. That includes huge terrorist gangs, rapists. I was working for 3 of those 5 years with the then Home Secretary Theresa May, who commended the work that I did at the end of those 5 years.
Yes, he failed to mention that she was the one that gave him the knighthood, actually.
Yes.
Which was an unusual act of modesty.
He doesn't like mentioning the knighthood.
He doesn't mention that, yeah. Interesting, some breaking news, though, that we've got here, and this is actually supposedly a good piece of news for Labour. This is an exclusive on Talk. Labour have successfully deported 37 people to Pakistan on Tuesday night, which is what Keir Starmer referring to as a record flight. He said this during Prime Minister's question. So we found out exactly what the number was. It's not massive. It's 37 people. But it's a start, I suppose.
It is a start, and in the technicalities of this, it's just worth remembering that you might say, well, 37, you could get more than 37 people on a plane, but in order to make sure that the plane is safe, actually, you need so many guards and so many ratio. It's quite a low ratio. But it's the right.
Can they
thing.
not just charter a plane and put 400 people on it?
But you just can't put too many, because you might just get some nutcase who just wants to bring the whole thing down. But it's the right thing, and I think. But it's worth remembering, of course, the backlog started from under Rishi Sunak in terms of asylum claims of over 160,000.
I mean, that is the trouble, isn't it? The numbers game doesn't work.
Huge, and also you've got to stop the boats crossing the English Channel in the first place. We're now up to 33,000 plus for the year, up on 29,000 from last year.
Well, 37 people being deported to Pakistan is not even one boat, is it?
No,
because they're now getting about 50 people on these boats, each per boat.
And that's part of the problem is actually as they confiscate the engines and they confiscate the boats, that actually the gangs are taking greater chances in terms of putting more people into the boats across the channel. But I think it was if Kemi Badenoch's record and the Tories had a decent record on immigration, it would be a fair set of questions from Kemi Badenoch. The problem is that she hasn't anticipated the answer, and the Tory record on immigration was abysmal. That's why Nigel Farage did so well, because they didn't deliver on their promises on immigration, going all the way back to David Cameron in 2010, when he said he'd cut net migration to the tens of thousands, and then we've seen
they've never done it,
and the figures were up at more than 900,000, revised up to more than 900,000. They've come down slightly to just over 700,000. But they're just their record was abysmal. And it's interesting, actually, Kemi Badenoch has done an interview in The Spectator now where she's saying that actually she doesn't have a red line over collaborating, working with Nigel Farage. And going by what happened yesterday, I think, and the number of defections we've seen from really key people like Nick Candy, Tim Montgomery, who I know appears on this show, a big conservative thinker. I think actually now that the direction that we're heading to some sort of merger.
Well, the Tories are very much on the back foot, aren't they? You can see that, because in the end of the day, I mean, people have stopped asking the question, will you accept reform into the Tory party? It's now the conversation's going the other way. Will reform let you guys into their party? Because they've got all the momentum.
Yes, and I think that there's going to come a point fairly soon where reform surpass around 130,000 members, which is, of course, where we know from the last leadership election the Tories are at. And I think at that point, the conversation is going to change dramatically. And think about it like I was sort of trying to imagine it as I was talking to a friend about it, a supermarket war, and suddenly Aldi's become bigger than Morrison's, and it's going to be the Morrison's would be subsumed by Aldi.
Well, yesterday, I think it was yesterday or just the day before, the bookies are now putting Nigel Farage as the favourite to be the next Prime Minister.
Yes.
Above Labour, above the Tories.
And what's critical about this sort of who merges with whom is that what Nigel Farage won't want to happen is to fall into the trap that Boris Johnson did, where the Tories all rally round and say, isn't he great, he's won us an 80-seat majority, but the mechanisms within the party allow that once Nigel Farage, or as Boris Johnson did, secured that 80-seat majority, the MPs can just boot him out. And I think Farage and Reform are very wary that if they'd gone too early with that merger and not tried and ended up in a situation where Nigel Farage fits into the Tory mould, then suddenly he becomes a Conservative Prime Minister. But you know how febrile, we know how febrile the Tory party is.
But he won't do that.
Just slinging him.
But I don't think he's interested in that. I mean, he said many times publicly, I want to destroy the Tory party. That's what he's doing.
Yes, and he is doing it, but I think at some point there is going to have to be, in order to secure a majority in the House of Commons, there's going to have to be some sort of arrangement with the Conservative Party where Conservative and Reform work together. And when that happens, and I'm sure Labour have anticipated it, when that happens, Keir Starmer at the next election is in dire trouble. Because if he can bridge that, if Farage, and whether it's Kemi Badenoch or some other leader, can bridge that gap, it would be, you know, and you bring all of those
I just think at this point, I think at this point Farage doesn't want to do that. I think he just wants to win it, and I think he can. If he gets enough money from the combination of Nick Candy's 40 million that he's going to raise and whatever money he's going to get from Elon Musk, money buys you a government, I'm afraid. I mean, it might not be supposed to be happening that way,
and that's why,
but that's what it happened. That's
why there's been soundings off from in Labour circles about the idea of bringing in a cap on donations. Of course, you already can't.
Now they want a cap.
They want a cap.
Now they're in. Funny that. Coming up, we're going to be talking about what's on the front pages as well as this horrific story about little Sarah. Labour bid to bulldoze the home counties on the front of the Telegraph. Also, police and staff are threatening to strike because they want the right to work from home. Absolutely extraordinary stuff. Oh, by the way, Donald Trump has been named as Time magazine's Person of the Year, which will be upsetting to an awful lot of lefties and snowflakes. There he is. He's on the cover of Time magazine, a great magazine. I love that magazine.